out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your Pest Geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube. We're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Stephen Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant, bringing you another episode of The Wildlife. Wanted to talk today a little bit about plague. You may have heard of it in your history books. We took history class. The Black Plague was a major epidemic that swept through Europe, and reports are that it killed anywhere from 25% to 30% of Europe at the time, if not more in some areas. It certainly swept through during the 13th and the 15th centuries, if memory serves. It was a massive, massive event. In fact, that was the second great outbreak of plague. There's been three, one in Justinian's period. I think that was in the 4th century AD. And then we had another epidemic that occurred, I believe, in the 1800s. Perhaps into the 1900s, where plague also killed thousands of people. So we've had some major epidemics with plague. So I want to talk a little bit about plague. Those of you on the East Coast don't have to worry about it per se, but I think it's important to know things because things change, and I'll talk a little bit about how that can certainly happen. So let's talk a little bit about plague. Plague is a bacterial infection caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. So the name has changed from what it was back in earlier years. So Yersinia pestis is the bacteria that causes plague. It's very virulent. In other words, it attacks living tissue very aggressively when you're infected. And it wasn't native to the United States. It didn't occur in the United States till about 1900, where it's believed it came in on a ship from China, I believe, or certainly the Orient, and then it came to San Francisco and became endemic there, and there was an outbreak of plague in San Francisco, California, and it spread out into the ground squirrels. And then off it went, and then it just slowly marched its way west. And so that we now have plague as far as the Missouri River in the United States. It's endemic in California, and you'll have these epizootics. It's periods of time where it just sort of erupts, where it goes silent, and then it erupts into the wildlife, where there'll be incidents of plague among ground squirrels, certainly prairie dogs. It occurs in Montana, for instance, where prairie dogs will have a large prairie dog town, and then all of a sudden the prairie dog town disappears in the time of about 2 weeks. It kills almost 100% of them, and so it's a major issue. There aren't many human infections with plague, but it's not unheard of, particularly in the area of the Southwest. And I recently had the opportunity to speak with a lady who was infected in South Dakota, where she was working with prairie dogs, and it turned out that she was wearing some protective equipment, but she believes that she was infected by getting contaminated with infected tissue. And came into some cuts on her arms, because she said that she can't rule out a prairie dog a flea bite, but she thinks that may not be the way that she was infected. She was skinning out an animal and working with them, and she thinks that some of the blood tissue got up on her arms where she had some cuts and scratches. So it's serious. Let's talk a little bit about some of the symptoms of this particular infection. So when you are exposed to plague, typically it's through a flea bite, where a flea bites an animal that is infected with plague. It gets a blood meal. All of you pest controllers know this probably far more than I do, where it gets a blood meal, and then as it has some of that bacteria in its system, it then bites another person who is not infected or another organism that's not infected, and then transmits that bacteria to the new host. If there's a sufficient dose, inoculation it's called, then that person or organism, like a prairie dog or ground squirrel, can start replicating that bacteria in their system. And again, as I said earlier, it is a virulent bacteria, so it is aggressive. And if their body, so as that begins to mature, then that organism begins to start having some symptoms. Now for humans, those symptoms go as follows. Typically, it starts with some sort of a severe headache. You may get a fever. You'll get aches. And so you'll think initially that you have the flu. And so this is one of the challenges with a lot of zoonotic diseases, because plague is a disease that we can contract from wildlife. That's what zoonotic means. It's a disease that we can contract from wild animals. That when we have this plague, it has symptoms when we contract it where we think we have the flu. And so there we can delay our treatment, and that's serious. So the incubation period for plague, that is the time that between that you were bitten by a flea let's say, and the time that you begin to show symptoms, an infected flea, I should say, and the time you begin to show symptoms is anywhere from 2 to 6 days. So it's quite rapid. So chances are you should be able to remember. A lot of zoonotic diseases take a lot longer to emerge, but plague's pretty fast, so you should know pretty quickly. So if you're working with ground squirrels, prairie dogs, and you're in plague country, which is pretty much wherever you find those, then in the West, then it's a possibility if you start coming down with a severe fever and chills and headache and body aches, and you may have been exposed to plague. I mean, no one knows until you go to the doctor. The problem is it can take a few weeks for you to get the results of that, so they'll often just start you on antibiotics quickly. So I may not have mentioned this earlier in earlier podcasts, but let me repeat it again. I encourage people who are working with wildlife or in areas where you are in contact with wildlife, and even if you're a pest controller and you're doing some bug work at a house, you may go into a crawl space where you could be exposed to fleas and other organisms that expose you to various diseases. And so the USDA Wildlife Services has a card that you can go online and download, and you basically put this card in your wallet. And what you do is every time you go to a physician, you hand the physician this card, and you want to remind your physician all the various types of diseases that you could be exposed to. And they will have a list of the most common ones. But when we say common, that means common zoonotic diseases, not common diseases to the average person in the United States. And this gives your doctor a reminder that he or she needs to be looking for infections and signs of diseases that are rather uncommon, but they're not necessarily uncommon for people who work with wildlife. Because you are the zebras. You may have heard me say this before. In medicine, they teach medical personnel, when you hear hoofbeats, don't think zebras. Well, it makes sense. We don't have zebras in the United States. But the problem is in our business, we're the zebra. We're exposed to things that the average individual simply will not be exposed to. So we need to help our medical professionals reach back into that class that they had on various diseases and kind of help get them to refresh their memory to be looking for the unusual with us. All right. So going back to those symptoms again, headache, fever, aches. Sometimes there'll be nausea. Sometimes there'll be vomiting. And this will progress. I mean, the lady that I spoke with, her symptoms went splitting headache. Then she had some body aches, particularly in her big joints. That was her hips and then her knees. And then that began to go away. And she started getting the buboes around her armpits and her groins. Now, the buboes is where you have a concentration of bacteria that occurs in your lymph nodes, and it begins to form these hardened nodules. Now, that's a late sign. So she was having this infection for several days, and thankfully a friend of hers said, you need to go to the doctor. And so she went and finally got treated, and she's all better now. But that could have gotten septic, where the infection continues to multiply and it gets into your bloodstream. And then you start having a severe systemic, that means body-wide infection that takes place, and it starts attacking your organs. Very, very serious. Don't want to let it get that far. Thankfully, again, she was treated with antibiotics, and she has recovered from that. But once it goes septic, you have a high chance of dying. So it may be hard to believe, because bubonic plague is very curable if it's caught soon enough. If the longer you wait to treat it, the greater your chance of a severe damage to your body or death. So much more detail is available on the Centers for Disease Control website. They will have some very easy to understand material there for you. I would strongly encourage you to just visit those web pages, learn a little bit about it. There are epizootics that occur. Those are little eruptions of plague that occur in the West from time to time. And you want to make sure you're paying attention to that, because you don't want to be that statistic. Bubonic plague comes in various forms. One of the ways that plague occurs is, obviously I mentioned bubonic. That's the most common one. It's where you have the buboes, where you have this large and hardened nodule in your lymph nodes, typically along the neck, armpit, or groin area. But you can also have other forms of plague. One of them is called pneumonic plague. And pneumonic plague is the most severe. It's where the plague bacteria, becomes aerosolized and attacks the lungs. You actually become infected because you inhale the bacteria. The likelihood of death for pneumonic plague is extraordinarily high. I believe it's somewhere in the 90% level. Even when treatment's fairly rapid, because of how quickly it multiplies, it attacks your body. So that's serious. But fortunately, that form of plague is exceedingly rare, but it's not unheard of. So it's something to keep in the back of your mind. This is why we have to cover our cough, right? So we don't want to be spreading things like that. But thankfully, it's relatively rare. So you may think, hey, I'm not dealing with this type of wildlife. I'm not out killing prairie dogs. I'm not out controlling ground squirrels. But I want to sort of touch base with something for those of you, particularly working in the West, and that is, we need to be thinking about the role of cats. Yeah, that's right. I said cats, free-range cats. Now, anyone who knows me knows I have a long-standing animosity towards free-ranging cats. Why? Because, as I said, they're an environmental menace. Well, one of the things that we find with free-ranging cats, now a free-ranging cat is a cat that's owned, but it's a cat that's allowed to go in the house, outside the house, in the house, outside the house. It's free-range. It's not confined to a specific area. So these cats are being let go outside, typically at night, and they're out ravaging, killing all kinds of animals and wildlife, because that's what cats do. Doesn't make the cat a bad animal. It means there's a lot of bad owners out there who just simply don't care about the environment. So their cats are out ravaging things. So their cats are coming into contact with wildlife. And what's happening is that those cats, as they're killing various animals, they're coming into contact with fleas, and some of those fleas can be infected. So there have been cases of people who have picked up cats. The fleas have jumped from the cat to the human and transmitted plague because the cat contracted plague and then the fleas transmitted plague to owners or people that handled cats. So don't just think that you have to be necessarily working with prairie dogs or ground squirrels. You can have another intermediary animal that's moving the disease from the wild to you. This is why when you're crawling under decks and crawl spaces that cats have access for, you want to be thinking about, what are the little creepy crawlies that are flying around underneath there, particularly for those of us who are out here in the West where plague can be an issue. Dogs could be the same thing, but typically seems to be cats have a higher incidence of this. And you can see the kind of data that would be available on the CDC website if you care to follow up a little bit more. Now, what about you guys out on the East Coast? You may think, hey, we don't have plague out here, and that's certainly true, but I was able to talk with a leading rodent control expert, and if I said his name, you would know exactly who I'm talking about. He's a well-known individual, and he was doing some monitoring in a major eastern city, and what he found was that the oriental flea occurred in a major city. Now, the plague is usually transmitted by what they call the plague triangle. The plague triangle is you have to have the bacteria, you need to have the flea, the best flea for carrying plague is the oriental flea. There are other fleas can carry it, but the oriental flea is like the best carrier, transmitter of plague. And then you have to have, of course, the rat. Well, they were doing some surveying and they were checking out various rats to see what kind of fleas that they had. And lo and behold, they found that in this major eastern city, they found the oriental flea. So think about that for a minute. They had the rats, of course. They had the oriental flea. The only thing that was missing was the plague itself. So if you don't think that there's a precariousness, all it would take is one infected rat jumping off a ship, coming into that city's harbor, living long enough to spread those fleas elsewhere in that particular environment, and all of a sudden you could have a major outbreak in a particular major metropolitan city. So I'm not saying this to make you scared. I want to be sure that you are aware of sometimes when people think, why are we killing all these rats? Why are we doing this sort of control? Why can't we just go along to get along? And that people don't realize just how precarious our control over nature sometimes is. And that all it takes is just one little turn of the crank, so to speak, and all of a sudden the floodgates of various diseases can be unleashed in our society. And so you folks out there have an important role in protecting public health. But I want you to be sure that you're protecting your own health while you're protecting public health. So we don't want to cause paranoia. We want to empower you with information so that you can keep things in the back of your mind. Because again, the risk out for you guys in the East Coast, haven't heard of plague out there in the East Coast. For those of us in the West, it's something that is rare, but not unheard of. So again, it's all about understanding what your potential risk is, but not get arrogant and thinking that, the odds are small, I'm going to be okay. No, some of us are going to win that lottery that we don't want to win. So keep that in mind. Understand how plague is spread. And so we want to be controlling those fleas. We want to be thinking about how is that disease being vectored. And we want to kind of pay attention to what is happening with diseases in our particular part of the world. Are we paying attention? Do you have conversations with your public health department? Are you visiting their website? Are you just being aware? And I'm hoping this will stimulate you to think more about this particular disease, and hopefully it won't occur in your particular area. Well, I think that's enough for now. I'm Stephen Van Tassel, Wildlife Control Consultant. Did want to add one more thing. We'd love to hear from you in terms of your ideas for future podcasts. Definitely drop me an email. I'd love to get your comments wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Again, I'm Stephen Van Tassel. Thanks for listening, and back to you, Frank.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.